But if anyone in your organization is thinking like, maybe these rollbacks mean enforcement is relaxing, these next few minutes are definitely for you. A month ago, the EPA, the Department of Justice, and the West Virginia DEP announced a $450 million settlement with Chemours. It's the first comprehensive federal PFAS enforcement action against the manufacturer. And the terms were $22.5 million for a civil penalty over 3 years. So it's quite a hefty enforcement for the circular liability there. But narrow rulemaking does not mean relaxed enforcement. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm Bill Palmer. I'm a product advisory manager here at Cority. And I'm joined by Brian Smith, who is a senior solutions consultant at Cority as well. Thank you for joining Forever Chemicals, How to Manage PFAS in Your Business. This session is U.S. focused and built for EHS professionals. So over the next hour, we'll cover what's confirmed, what's proposed, and what it means for the program that you run. So here's the plan for today in 4 parts. First, what PFAS are and why they've become an urgent priority for EHS teams. Second, we'll look at the U.S. regulatory picture as it stands today. Again, what's confirmed, what's proposed, what's changed, which happens every day, I feel like. Third, we'll look at how the courts and states are reshaping compliance obligations, because a lot of the actions right now are outside of the federal rulemaking umbrella. And then finally, Brian's going to show you what a working PFAS program looks like within Cority One. So chemical requests, waste profiles, water monitoring, spill reporting, and compliance tasking in one operational view. And then again, we'll hold questions at the end. So make sure that you submit those in the Q&A box. All right, so let's start with the basics a little bit, because the scale of this problem is still surprising to a lot of people. So PFAS stands for per or polyfluoroalkyl substances, and they're a family of more than 12,000 individual chemical compounds. They've been manufactured since the 1940s, and because the carbon-fluorine bond is one of the strongest in organic chemistry, they don't break down. So not in the environment, not in human tissue, and that's where the forever label comes from. The exposure numbers are quite staggering, to be honest with you. So studies show that 99% of people globally have detected PFAS in their blood. And in the United States, more than 100 million Americans are estimated to have PFAS in their drinking water above EPA's set limits. So these aren't, trace exposures in remote communities. It's, actually a mainstream contamination problem. And it shows up in facilities, in supply chains, and water systems that EHS professionals, you guys, are responsible for managing. The confirmed health effects include kidney and testicular cancer, thyroid disease and hormone disruption, immune suppression with reduced vaccine response, developmental effects in fetuses and infants, and also liver damage. So for PFOAs specifically, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, so the IARC, they classified it as a group 1 human carcinogen in December of 2023. And if you guys, are familiar with that, it's the same category as asbestos and benzene. So it's a pretty serious thing. There is no identified safe lower bound for PFOAs and PFOS exposure. So I do want to address something directly here at the beginning, because I know some of you are watching the regulations, watching the headlines and thinking, if rules are being pulled back, maybe the science is in question too. Well, it's definitely not. The science on PFOAs is not in dispute at all. Like, as I just mentioned, the IARC classified it as a group 1 carcinogen in 2023. So whatever happens in rulemaking, it doesn't necessarily change what we know about the human health, right? That aspect of this. So that matters for your EHS program in very practical reasons, because when you're defending a compliance decision to your board, or to a regulator, or to a plaintiff's attorney, God forbid, but if you are, and you say something like the rule wasn't finalized yet, that's not going to be an adequate answer, especially if you knew the health evidence and didn't act on it, right? So the regulatory uncertainty we're going to talk about today is real, but it's not the same as the scientific uncertainty, right? So understanding that distinction is very foundational for how you should be structuring your PFAS response right now. Here's the operational reality, and this is kind of getting into the meat and potatoes of this. So PFAS lands on many different parts of your EHS program at once. So you have things like chemical management, which PFAS are in your products or supply chains. You have TSCA Section 8A7, and that requires a look back to 2011. And that data doesn't necessarily, live within your system. It's in your supplier SDSs and things like that from 2011 until now. So you have the environmental reporting or environmental monitoring piece where sampling 6 PFAS EPA MCLs by April of 2027, plus NEPDES permit conditions and CERCLA release reporting. So when you look at reporting and compliance piece of this, TRI covers 206 PFAS with no de minimis exemption. And the TSCA look back opens in January 2027. And then you also have states like Minnesota, Washington, New Mexico, and they have their own reporting on top of that system. When we look at waste and disposal, there are no federal waste classifications after the RECA rule was withdrawn in May of this past year, but you have CERCLA liability that follows the contamination. So disposal today can create a retroactive Superfund exposure, and we'll definitely talk about that here in a few minutes and what that really means. And then when you look at incident response, a release of 1 pound of PFAS in 24 hours triggers a CERCLA notification. So most systems nowadays stop at just flagging the chemical, right? But obviously, when you look at all of these regulations and the programs that they touch, PFAS demands an overall program. So let's look at the federal picture real quick of where regulations stand. And we've talked about it a little bit so far, but we have 5 statutes, we have multiple agencies, and we have one big program to build, right, to maintain compliance with this stuff. So the Safe Drinking Water Act sets the drinking water MCLs for PFOAs and PFOSs, and that's in force with initial monitoring due April of 2027. CERCLA designates PFOAs and PFOSs as hazardous substances, carrying release reporting and Superfund liability. And that's in force, as we'll see here in a few minutes too. But we also have a court decision that's expected in the second half of this year that may change that a little bit, and we'll talk about that too. TSCA Section 8A7 is the manufacturer and importer look back that covers all PFAS since 2011. And that's been delayed. So now roughly that reporting window opens on January 31st of 27. We have TRI, and that requires annual release reporting on 206 PFAS, and it's fully intact. And the July 1st deadline just passed. So, and then when we look at RECRA, as we mentioned before, there is no PFAS specific hazard waste rule, but you have the CERCLA release liability piece of that, which kind of rolls that in. You really need to monitor those things. So not one of these fully overlaps the other, but the program you need to manage all of this and maintain compliance, to be able to show an auditor and be doing the right thing, that spans all 5. And that's even just looking at before what the states require on top of this too. Drinking water is the rule that really anchors everything, in my opinion. So in April of 2024, EPA finalized MCLs for 6 PFAS. PFOAs and PFOSs are set at 4 parts per trillion, and those 2 are confirmed. The current administration, as you may have heard, has explicitly defended those, but the other 4 MCLs, so the PFHs, those are at 10, PFNAs are at 10, and Gen X are at 10 parts per trillion. And then, of course, you have the hazard index for mixtures. Those are reported for or proposed for rescission. So they're proposed, not final. So we need to make that distinction. So they're still law today. So if the rescission doesn't go through, you're going to have to make sure that you comply with all 6 of these MCLs. So here's the operational takeaway. And it's on the slide in the call out there. So even if EPA rescinds those 4 MCLs, the April 2027 initial monitoring deadline doesn't change for the initial, right? So it covers all 6 PFAS. So you can't skip a test just because, you think an MCL might go away. On compliance, the current deadline is April of 2029. So there's a proposed extension to 2031, I believe, but it's not finalized. So 2029, as it stands today, is the operative date. And I want to be precise here about the May rollback, because a lot of the headlines that came out were a little bit louder than the substance was. But EPA published 2 rules, May 18th and 20th. And the comment period just closed last Monday, or this past Monday on the 20th. So both are now moving toward final rulemaking. And here's really the scorecard that we're trying to keep track of. So PFOAs and PFOSs, MCLs are going to be kept at 4 parts per trillion, like we said, in force. We're going to keep those things. The 4 other MCLs are going to be proposed for rescission because of a procedural defect. But again, they're still law today. And then again, I talked about the proposed operational extension they may be putting intact that moves it from 2029 to 2031. But as of right now, as it stands today, 2029 is still the date to keep track of. So as far as the record constituents rule, like we said earlier, it was withdrawn entirely. And then the section 8A7, there are some exemptions proposed, but they're not finalized. So there's a de minimis exemption at 0.1%. There's also an R&D exemption and exemption for articles as well. But until those go through, there are no exemptions for 8A7. So now, the bottom row, what did not roll back? The circle of PFOAs and PFOS designation, which EPA is actively defending in court. The TRI reporting for 206 PFAS, that's unchanged. And then $1 billion in infrastructure law, water funding is still available. Okay, so if anyone in your organization is thinking like, maybe these rollbacks mean enforcement is relaxing, these next few minutes are definitely for you. So on June 24th, which, a month ago, the EPA, the Department of Justice, and the West Virginia DEP announced a $450 million settlement with Chemours. It's the first comprehensive federal PFAS enforcement action against the manufacturer, and it covers Washington Works in West Virginia, Fayetteville Works in North Carolina, and Chambers Works in New Jersey. And the terms were $22.5 million for a civil penalty over 3 years. There's 14 treatment system projects at Washington Works, at least 99% control on Gen X releases at all 3 facilities, and then a $90 million mitigation program over 50 years. And then, finally, there's more than $280 million for alternative drinking water there too. So it's quite a hefty enforcement for the circle of liability there. So a proposed rollback, so looking at this, objectively, a proposed rollback of the regulations and a $450 million enforcement action landed in the same month. So, that's 2 opposite ends of the spectrum there. So narrow rulemaking does not mean relaxed enforcement. And, write this down, I said it once before, but, if you have 1 pound of PFOA or PFOS that's released in any 24-hour period, that means you have to immediately notify the National Response Center. Okay, so looking at court cases that are going to help decide the future. So there's 2 cases in the DC circuit that will decide much of the future here. So first, there's Chamber of Commerce versus EPA, and that's docket 24-1193 if you want to look it up. The challenge to circle hazardous substance designation is what that is really encompassing. So EPA confirmed in September 25 that it would defend the rule, and oral argument was made in January 20th of this year. A decision of that is expected in the second half of 2026. So today, until that decision is issued, the designation stands and circle obligations are fully enforceable, as we just saw with the Chemours case. If it's vacated, the RQ reporting framework that we just talked about and that retroactive Superfund liability structure, that collapses and goes away entirely. So everything that we just saw, with Chemours, that stuff would go away depending on that court outcome. The second court case that we'll look at is the American Water Works Association versus EPA. And the challenge to the 2020, what this is the challenge to the 2024 Safe Drinking Water Act MCL rule. And in January, the court denied immediate vacatur, saying that the merits weren't that clear. And in March, it denied a motion to sever the hazard index challenge. So meanwhile, the EPA is pursuing administrative rescission, again, that we talked about, of 4 MCLs at the same time. So that's kind of the dual track that we're keeping track of here. Is there's a judicial track and an administrative track that are running in parallel right now, and both are live. Both have things going on. So for planning purposes for you as EHS professionals, you can't really assume that any of this is going to disappear. And what I would do, proactively is to plan to comply with these things as they're stated today. Looking at TSCA section 8A7, that's the rule that really surprises the most companies from what I've seen. And it requires that any entity that manufactured or imported PFAS or PFAS-containing articles from any point from January 1st, 2011 through December 31st of 2022, they have to report to the EPA. And then if you look at that timeline there on the slide, the final rule was published in October 23, it was delayed in 24, delayed again in May 25, and a fourth extension finalized in April 8 of this year. So the window as it stands now opens January 31st of 2027, and that's kind of the backstop for it, unless that changes. So 4 delays, 0 rescissions, and the final rule is intact. So, plan to comply with that one. And scope really matters here. So what, manufactured means synthesis, right? So processing, distributing, or using alone doesn't really trigger the rule, but importing PFAS containing articles does. And many companies did that without tracking it. So the proposed exemptions would greatly help this, but again, they're just proposed. That's the articles at or below the 0.1%. Any byproducts or impurities or R&D uses are not final yet. So don't scope your look back when you start looking at these things. Don't scope your look back around exemptions that don't exist yet. Reporting runs through EPA CDX portal that most of us are familiar with. It's roughly for 6 months, and then small article importers get an extra 6 months on top of that. So if you haven't started your 2011 look back, January 2027 is much closer than it appears, and we're going to blink and we're going to be there. So it's something you definitely want to look into getting done. All right, now let's look at TRI and state requirements. So let's start with TRI. So again, all 206 listed PFAS are chemicals of special concern. And that means there are no de minimis exemptions. There's a 100-pound per year reporting threshold and supplier notification regardless of the concentration. So, and the hard truth for us, right, is the reporting year 2025 deadline that covered 205 PFAS was July 1st, so 22 days ago. So that's 3 weeks ago. So if you haven't filed, you might want to do that. But reporting year 2026 that covers the full 206, that's next July, so July 1st of 27. And again, there's going to be no de minimis change or no threshold change and no rollback to that. So that is going to keep going every year as is. And now looking at the states, and this is where it can get a little hairy because, federal rollbacks do not preempt state law. So active product bans took effect on January 1st in Maine, Colorado, Vermont, and Washington. Connecticut's contained PFAS labeling for apparel, cleaning products, and cookware is already required. So if you sell anything into Connecticut, you'll want to verify your status there. New Mexico's product regulations are in effect. Minnesota, who has some of the most stringent PFAS laws in the country, their PRISM reporting was extended to September 15th of this year. Washington's footwear, cookware, and wax reports come due January of 2027. New Jersey's bans phase in from 2028. And then New York's water standards are stronger than the federal water standards. So again, it's going above and beyond federal. So roughly, probably 100 PFAS bills across 17 states and more states are growing. So the state layer is growing no matter what happens federally. So that's something that you really want to pay extreme attention to, is not just, what's happening administratively with a lot of the regulations that we talked about and also the court cases that we talked about, but also what are the states doing? Because a lot of times, what we've seen, especially with PFAS is, since there's some kind of back and forth going on at the federal level, the states are like, hey, we're going to just jump in and go full bore here. So, please make sure that you monitor those state requirements that you operate in. Okay. And then looking at the compliance scorecard. So this is the slide to really photograph, at least as it stands today. Again, it changes all the time, but there's really 3 columns. So looking at confirmed, it means what's enforceable law today. So we have the safe drinking water MCLs for PFOAs, PFOSs at 4 parts per trillion with the 2029 compliance deadline. We have the CERCLA designation with the 1 pound RQ immediately enforceable. We have TRI reporting with no rollback. And then we have the TSCA section 8A7, which was delayed through January 2027, but not gone. We have the CHMOR scale enforcement of PFAS. And then, and that's because polluter pays is real and active. So for those, when we look at proposed, it means it's still law until it's finalized. So the rescission of the 4 Safe Drinking Water Act MCLs is on the proposed piece with the comment period now closed. The optional 2029 to 2031 compliance extension is out there. and then the TSCA exemptions that would narrow the scope of the Section 887 reporting. The things that are gone or absent right now are the record PFAS waste classification. Again, that was withdrawn in May, and that really leaves the CERCLA liability as the primary trigger for releases. There are no federal Clean Air Act PFAS standards right now, and then no OSHA exposure limit for workers. But again, if you don't have PELs, for worker protection, you're going to be working with the ACGIH TLVs, right? And which are advisory, and they do cover 3 PFAS. But you also have the general duty clause on top of that. So because we know the health effects that we talked about before, you still have to provide a workplace free of hazards. So PFAS is definitely a hazard that we have to look after. All right, so let's pull the calendar together as of today. So, July 23rd, 2 dates are already behind us, right? We have the July 1st TRI reporting deadline for 2025. And then again, if you haven't filed yet, you might want to do that as quickly as possible. July 20th, which was last Monday, that closed the comment period on EPA's 2 proposed PFAS rules. So final rulemaking is going to be coming next. What we have ahead of us is the DC Circuit decision on the CERCLA designation. And that's expected in the second half of this year. That could be at any time. And then September 15th, you have Minnesota PRISM product reporting. January 31st, 27 is the TSCA Section 887 window opens. And that gives you about 6 months to finish the article inventory and scope your submission. And then April 26th of 2027, the Safe Drinking Water Act initial monitoring for all 6 PFAS needs to take place. So knowing the regulations, I feel like, is the easy part, but building a program that really operationalizes and all 5 of these tracks at once with documentation that an auditor can pull on demand is where most programs fall apart. And that's where, the Cority 1 list on the right, new chemical requests, waste profile classification and disposal documentation, water monitoring against MCL thresholds, spill RQ and incident reporting, and compliance task management are all rolled into one operational view. So here's everything we just walked through in one program: chemical, water, waste, incidents, compliance tasking, tracked against every threshold that we covered today and rolled up into one operational view, as we just said, and with audit-ready reports before the regulator asks. So that's what Brian is going to take you through now. So Brian, I'll hand it over to you.
All right. Hello, everybody. As Bill said earlier, I'm Brian. I'm a senior solutions consultant here at Cority. So I'm going to walk us through kind of 2 parts. One being kind of, and Bill's touched on it a little bit, what standing up that overall PFAS program looks like, and then how we here at Cority 1 can help support that. So up to this point, Bill's been covering that background very heavily, and we're going to kind of shift that to that practical application. So kind of the big operational challenge with PFAS is it doesn't really just fit in one place, right? It spans lots of programs, it spans operations, and not all of those things are managed by the same person. You've got chemical inventories, waste records, processed chemicals that are being brought in that may contain things, and then all the tasks associated with your various compliance programs. And again, your waste guy may not be your water person. So they're managed separately. So when you get a PFAS question, it's not typically to one person. It's where is PFAS, right? So the issue really isn't missing data per se, but it's the ability to connect all of the data quickly enough to understand where PFAS used, how it's moving through your operation, what obligations it's creating. So a PFAS program really needs to bring all of those program markers together into one place so that you're managing it holistically. So positive, right? And we're all professionals here. Most organizations, we're not starting from zero. We already have chemical inventories, waste profiles, monitoring data. Again, the key is to get it all into one place. Structure, the separated structure works until we start getting questions. If a regulator, customer, internal leaders is asking questions, they want to know where PFAS exists, how it's being managed, and whether the organization is meeting all of its obligations. So without alignment across those programs, answering the question that requires manual coordination, interpretation, and follow-up every time you get a question. So by creating that consistency across all of those records, it gives you that one defensible answer supported by the underlying data. So, kind of starting, how does PFAS enter an organization? It's normally through kind of normal operational change. A supplier might reformulate product, substitute materials approved to avoid downtime, new chemical introduced, and a process modification may change how a chemical moves through the process into a waste stream. None of those decisions necessarily look like a PFAS event until it happens and you get that downstream sample result or customer request on those items. And you have to then backtrack and check where it's coming from. By that point, it's already in use. You can't, it's harder to remove, right? Forever. So by having, a dedicated PFAS program, it puts controls around those change points. So the PFAS implications are identified earlier before they become a compliance issue. So, once PFAS enters the operation, next question is, where is it going? It begins in materials and processes, but it doesn't always stay there. Wastewater, residuals, waste stream, storage areas, all of those, and environmental releases. And obviously that's where regulatory attention typically is concentrated. The result appears in outfall, permit adds monitoring condition, et cetera. At that point, we're playing catch up. The organization has to trace the result back to the original material process. But, by having that program set up from the onset to the outset, you're able to know coming in, right? I had new chemical come in. This result is going to be tied back to likely that process change. The goal here is to really make PFAS more manageable over time. As I've been describing, that kind of that ad hoc model of, an issue comes in, you investigate, you send all the things is fine, but it doesn't scale well. So as more of these questions come up, more regulations come in, it becomes harder and harder to manage and requires more effort. And then, responses may vary by site. Ownership may be unclear on the overall program, and you spend more time locating and coordinating information than managing the actual underlying risk. A programmatic model establishes ownership, consistent identification, connected records, and defined follow-up. So the result's not really less responsibility. It's just more control, predictable execution, and documentation that can be produced when asked for. So with that, I'm going to kind of move into how we here at 41 can help. So I'm going to focus in. I'm going to have a dashboard that kind of brings in all of those compliance areas into one place. The purpose here is to kind of show what that overall management looks like. It's not necessarily the individual solutions. All of those solutions kind of go into supporting that overall program. The operational view is going to provide that visibility. So kind of starting off, a PFAS dashboard is that starting point. It brings all of your related activities into one view instead of beginning with each individual program and having to click through records to find things. You can kind of start, it's all here, and then go from there. It does not replace those underlying records, right? It's just directing you to them. It gives the teams a shared view of the program and reduces the need for someone to manually assemble the PFAS picture each time a question is asked. Kind of today's focus, I'll really be looking at chemicals, waste, water, and overall compliance, and just kind of touching on how those can be displayed and support that purpose. So, this view is turning your PFAS requirements into that scheduled workflow. We can see the calendar showing upcoming tasks due, whether those are permit-driven activities, sampling events, any follow-up activities tied to a regulatory visit. The critical point is not simply documenting the requirement, it's seeing the work early enough to act. By having this, teams can identify what is approaching before it becomes urgent and what is overdue before it becomes a larger compliance issue. Again, these are just examples here, but, open tasks that need to be completed, overdue tasks, and then again, that compliance calendar. Next, this is kind of the big one, right? Which is that chemical process. With the chemical approval, that's kind of the earliest point. You could also say MOC, that kind of hand in hand for that PFAS program, right? New chemical requests is that first opportunity to identify where PFAS is before it even arrives on site or enters the process. New chemicals can be flagged based on CAS numbers associated with PFAS. That flag, prompts additional review of SDS, supplier information, et cetera. And then you can dig into potential downstream effects. Again, it's kind of that gateway to the broader program. So instead of discovering it later with your lagging items, when it's being disposed of or out in your outfalls, you can identify it ahead of time and potentially stop it from coming on site. And then once approved, a PFAS, if a PFAS chemical is approved, which is probably less likely, but it remains visible through your chemical inventory and, can then translate into, those waste streams if you're disposing of chemicals that contain PFAS. And again, that upstream, the gateway, this is the big one that really gives us that insight into, or gives us that first checkpoint into the overall program and controlling how we have PFAS at our site. Next, waste management, just shows your waste containing PFAS material, how it's classified, stored, shipped, and disposed. You have your approved waste profiles to establish that consistent record of the waste stream. Here I have, PFAS waste profile approval status, as well as, the map with locations that have PFAS containing waste, and then our overall manifest tracking of shipments that contain PFAS. So this is, again, just kind of a deeper view into your waste system where you're really focusing on PFAS waste, not just your overall program, to give you that direct eye into where that stuff is going and where it's being stored and where you need to monitor it. And you can follow it from generation all the way to disposal. It just helps provide that defensible chain of documentation of how PFAS leaves the operation through waste. And then kind of lastly here, I have water. Water monitoring data shows where it's being detected and how those results change over time. The outfall kind of table here, it can summarize by monitoring location, elevated concentrations or potential exceedances as we see more of those in drinking water. Additionally, specific states, I believe my examples here are all based around some Wisconsin rules, which are a bit stricter. That this allows environmental use to quickly identify where attention is needed and move into the supporting sample and analytical records. I also have some groundwater trending. Groundwater sampling is a big part. Again, in Wisconsin, in my previous life, I had a facility that we were concerned with. So, it just helps kind of see what those trends are looking like over time. And again, this is all just meant to combine, right? This is not really looking at the individual solution. I'm looking at how all of these solutions support the broader PFAS program. Additionally, I don't have an image here, but Bill mentioned was, release reporting, right? So if you have a chemical release, you're able to put that in and be able to calculate that RQ to make sure that those PFAS chemicals are identified and you're reporting to the NRC if needed to. Sorry. I jumped ahead too fast. I had something else to say. So, as we know, the regulatory landscape is going to continue to change. So some requirements may be delayed, narrowed, challenged, but the operational need really doesn't change. We still need to identify PFAS consistently, assign that ownership, monitor the right information, and really be able to provide that defensible response anytime we're asked a question, and it be consistent. It's not just being able to respond. It's that you're not wasting hundreds of hours building that response because everything's in one place and you're able to quickly access all of those things. And again, it's consistent across your organization. With Cority One, again, chemical review, waste tracking, water monitoring, those are just examples of things that we can help support through that, giving your team those records and visibility, traceability across your organization. And with that, that's kind of what I had to share. So thanks, everybody.
Perfect. Thanks, Brian. So we'll open it up for questions now. So we did have a few questions come in and I think I can take this one. So the first question is, I thought the January 2027 EPA PFAS reporting rule was only the date for SMEs and other companies, non-SMEs have a 2026 reporting date. And I think this is where, this is a perfect example of the confusion around this stuff because they've changed dates so many times, it's hard to keep track of that stuff, right? So right now, standard filers, which are the non-SMEs, they're going to have exactly 6 months from the opening date to submit their data. And the opening date right now is January 31st of 27. The SMEs, the small article importers, they're going to have 12 months from that opening date to submit data. And that's as it stands right now. So if anything changes, though, if they postpone it again or, whatever happens, that's the date, right? So January 31st opens the window. Non-SMEs have 6 months and SMEs, the small articles, have 12 months. They get an additional 6. Another question that came in is PFAS its own module or an option within environmental? So it is not its own module, and that's intentional because it it shouldn't be, right? Because as I talked about at the beginning of this, PFAS and the management of PFAS, and based on the regulations and what those specific regulations are looking at, they live within other modules, right? So they live in chemical, and they live in incident reporting, and they live in water and in compliance overall, right? So there's pieces of that are a part of other modules. So what I would say, if you're looking at, standing up and managing a PFAS program and using EHS software to do that, I would start with what your main pain points are right now. Like, what do you struggle with? What's the biggest pieces of informational gaps that you have, and how can we fix those, and then we can expand from there, right? So that's kind of the way I've always done it, is that tiered approach is like, hey, what's first? What's the hottest thing on the fire? What do we need to get off first? And then let's just keep working at it and work that continual improvement process there. Okay, let's see here.
Well, so I take one. So the question is, does the software provide the ability to view and aggregate costs associated with PFAS materials and waste? We do have the ability to do cost tracking across parts of our platform. So it would, again, just be the matter of kind of filtering for PFAS specifically with those identified waste streams. So I would say, yes, we can accommodate cost tracking associated with PFAS and waste.
Well, that's all the time that we have for today. So I just want to thank you all for joining our webinar this morning. This is one of those topics that as a EHS guy, I love to talk about, because it's such a large conversation and it touches a lot of different things, and it's changing so darn fast that it's really hard to keep track of, right? So, I think as EHS professionals, there's times where we love that chase, and then there's times where we hate it. But I think this is a great topic. I think it's something that's going to be very relevant moving into the future. And again, if you guys have any questions or would like to see how more specifically we can assist you with any of these items and these modules, please just request a demo below. With that, thanks again. Appreciate everybody's time, and we'll talk to you next time. Thanks all.
Thank you.